Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the latest in our Cutting Edge Librarianship webinar series. I am so excited that today we have Colleen Van Lent, my colleague here at the University of Michigan School of Information. Some of you may know her from her work teaching web design for the Coursera MOOC platform as well. On the next slide, we have our sponsors. This series is made possible by the University of Michigan School of Information, the Library of Michigan, and the Institute of Museum and Library Services. On the next slide, we're going to take this to Colleen and she'll go ahead and get us started. I should say though, I always forget to do this with every webinar. I will be monitoring the chat throughout. I'll help with any questions that you have while Colleen is speaking, and I'll also keep an eye on the Q&A, so when she is ready for questions and answers, I'll have those questions ready for her. So please don't hesitate to use the chat window or even the Q&A window so that we can learn from you and hear what questions you have. All right, Colleen, over to you.
Thanks, Kristen. And I really do hope people use the chat because, you know, I've taught online for quite a while, but it's just not the same when you're just speaking and you don't know what people are interested in, what they wish they could go a little bit deeper in, etc. So I actually have a few points in today's webinar where I'm hoping people can kind of jump in and give me some feedback and some suggestions. So I wanted to start today just talking about the motivation and goals I had for this webinar. And the three big things I was thinking about is, you know, when you leave here today, I'd like you to be able to talk to others about, you know, why is web accessibility important? What you, in whatever role you play in your business, company, school, library, what can you do in big or small ways to kind of help move us along? And then I have a few slides at the end that are somewhat beyond web accessibility and just tips and tools that I have found useful that I wanted to share with you. So I feel like today you can leave this webinar feeling depressed, inspired, maybe a little bit of both. But no matter which one it is, I hope that when you leave here today, you really see things differently and we start looking at all the different barriers that we've been putting up for people and things we can do to knock those barriers down. So again, before I begin, I want to encourage you all to nominate a site if you'd like. I'm going to be running some accessibility checkers today in live. And I've picked a site or two, but I would love to use some that you suggest, preferably not one of your mortal enemy or nemesis, but you know, something that you often use yourself or that you suggest to your patrons on a regular basis, so we can look at the kind of issues that they might be looking at. Okay, so let's get started. My assumption is that you are here because you care about accessibility. Maybe you're here because you feel it's a moral obligation. Maybe you're realizing that your business really needs to look at this to increase the number of people you have visit. You might also be here because you realize that for legal reasons, more and more people need to think about accessibility. Regardless of why you're here, it never hurts for us to start off with some basic facts. All right, and one of the things that I looked at was the US Census Bureau and this idea that disability really impacts all of us. Right now, 61 million adults in the US live with some sort of disability. So that's 1 in 4. That number tends to be higher in some states, and it's highest of all down in the South, which if we think about it makes a lot of sense because we tend to have an older demographic. One other thing to think about is this 1 in 4. What does it mean to you when I say someone has a disability, right? Are you thinking of anything specific? Well, we tend to break disability down, although there are many different ways to look at it. We break it down into certain groups. Most people tend to think blind. When you say you need to make sure your website is accessible, they think, oh, for blind people. Well, the biggest disability that we tend to deal with is actually mobility. So about 14% of Americans have some sort of mobility issue. And in this chart, they talk about walking or climbing stairs, but we're going to talk a little deeper than that. Another 10% have cognition issues. And I often share with my students that I myself have vestibular issues. So if you're making a website for me, the last thing you want to do is make me nauseous right before I'm going to grade it. So let's see what we can do about that. About 7% of people have trouble with independent living. Again, let's think more deeply than that. What does that mean that people need help? Oftentimes it's doing small tasks, which means you, again, links back to the mobility issues. Do you have trouble even walking up small steps? Is it buttons? About 6% of people have some sort of hearing loss. It could be deafness, it could be more mild, but still an issue. And blindness and vision issues is really just, it's less than 5%. So why is it that that's the major disability people often think about? Well, it's because the Federation of the Blind is such a large group, and they've really done an incredible job of advocating for people. So if every disability group had that same type of advocacy, I think all of us would be more aware of these issues. All right, so you've seen this graph, and what I'd like you to think about for just a second is the communities you serve. I myself, I'm amazed every time I go into the Ann Arbor District Library, because there are just people from every socioeconomic background, people of different abilities. And it's something that, you know, I think about when I go in now. So if you're thinking about your communities, the ones that you personally serve, we tend to break it down and think about, well, the elderly population tends to have an entire group of themselves. And 2 out of 5 adults age 65 or older have a disability. 1 in 4 women have a disability, and 2 in 5 non-Hispanic American Indians and Alaska Natives have a disability. And I say have a disability, but it's so important for us to remember that oftentimes a person has more than one of these different groups. So you might have cognitive and mobile. You might have vision impairment and memory issues. Okay, so now that we're kind of thinking about your community, I did want to just for a second talk about, you know, where is Michigan in all this? Because this is where I was from. And again, I feel like you can use census data to go in and look at your community and say, I have limited resources, because we really do. We all have limited resources. Where can I get the most bang for my buck and help the most people? And hopefully we can look at ways that will help as many people as possible. The last thing I kind of wanted to talk about was this idea of the aging population. Back when I was doing my thesis, I was working on making a robotic assistant for the elderly, and I was planning for that faraway year of 2030, right? Well, we weren't that far off. They're showing that by 2035, we're actually gonna have more older adults over 65 than children 18, all right? What does this mean for us, right? What does it mean for your patrons? What does it mean for the people who are creating technology today? And I can tell you that sadly, many people who are creating this technology, they have the best of intentions, but they aren't thinking about their patrons as users. They're thinking of them as experiments, right? And so that's why I love working with people who are both technical and less technical, because you really are working one-on-one. Right. So I think we all agree, disabilities have a far-reaching effect in our community. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to take a look at a couple sites, and I was planning on starting with the Library of Congress, but I've got a few suggestions here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up my browser and go to owl.purdue.edu. So let me see if I can figure out how to do this in Zoom. All right.
I can see your browser.
Can they see it?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. All right, so what I've got here is I've got the OWL site up. I'm not going to quite go full screen, but I'm going to go pretty big. And what I like to do is I would like to show you how I can use some tools to look at websites from a different point of view. I've got to move the screen a little bit, sorry, because it says my name is talking right over the toolbar I need. I'm going to move it over a little bit. The 2 tools I like the best are, the first one I'm talking about is called Funkify. Funkify is very interesting in that you can experience what it's like to visit a website from someone else's point of view. So for instance, if I turn on Blurry Bianca, you kind of get an idea of what this site looks like if you have not blind, but definite vision impairment. I can also check for people who have color impairment, dyslexia, etc. Funkify used to be kind of my go-to site, but I'll admit I've moved away from Funkify because I know that myself personally, when I'm working with people trying to create software, I don't like the idea of trying on a persona, like using somebody's name. It's always an iffy thing. So I've recently discovered the Silk site. So same idea, we're still at OWL, and I'm going to investigate a little more deeply. So for instance, one of the things we talk about is, what if somebody had total color blindness? If you go to this site, for the most part, actually, they've done really well. As best as I can tell, everything is still distinguishable. It's such a nice, clean site. Good job, whoever suggested that one. I'm impressed. All right. Here's another thing to think about. I'm going to go back and reset this. So we talked about color blindness, tunnel vision. This is an interesting one that a lot of people don't think about. Sorry, as I close that up. And it's this idea of how much of your site can somebody actually see at once. And I really found that with the Library of Congress, it was very hard to navigate. Here, we can make the font bigger, smaller, and see what's going on. All right.
Hey, Colleen, I'm going to interrupt real quick. Is this a browser extension or a software install? And could you repeat the name of the tool?
Yeah. So thank you. I think we're there. All right, thank you. One of the things we talked about was this idea that everyone has so much information overload. So a lot of times, the things that are distracting people from your site is just things beyond your control. So we can look at things like this. Sorry, I'm going to turn that one off because I find it so distracting. This is perhaps one of my favorites, and sorry to put it that way, but it's close and dear to my heart. This idea of a lot of our patrons and my own students have some mobility issues with Parkinson's, kind of the shaky hands I call it. Have you ever gone to your site and tried to figure out, can I actually navigate my site using a mouse? One of my favorite examples, and I think we've all been there, is the idea of the check button, the radio buttons when you have to select something, and I keep trying to hit that little circle and I just can't get it. So one of the things we want to talk about today when we think about accessibility is not just how can we make it better for other people. We tend to think about the other people when we talk about disabilities. I want to go back to the site one for a second. Has anyone here ever tried to use their laptop or an iPad or their phone outside and had a horrible time trying to use their site outside because the sunlight was just too much? All right, so when we talk today about these different sites, we're going to try to ground them in that. I'm going to pick one more site just because Purdue, you did too well. You didn't make it interesting for me. I'm going to go here to mel.org. Thank you for the suggestion. The Michigan eLibrary. Oh, I think my students did a project on you once. And I'm going to go right here for just a second. And on this one, we're going to try read and write. All right. One of the things that university people in particular, I'm in that group, find hard to do is remember that they should be writing for the masses, and that the average, I think Lexile average is about 5th grade. So if somebody has a small vocabulary, how are they doing on their site? Do they recognize some of the words you're using? So this isn't really fair because you're such an important site, but kind of looking through here. Let's also look at, as I do this, I wanted to just touch one more little tip. Here in the Silk Tide, they also have Think About This. They try to give you tips, and that's what I'm going to be covering today. Avoiding difficult words and terms, places you can go to find out more. Okay. All right, so let's pop back over to the slides for a moment.
And in the chat, Sonia from Mel is saying, test us. We ran us through Hemingway.
Well, Sonia, I can still test you. I'm going to test you on one of the later ones. So what we're doing here isn't so much testing, I feel like, is experiencing. You know, it's easy again for us to think, oh, my site looks fine. But unless we're experiencing it as other people experience it, it's not quite the same. But I will absolutely test you. I'll test these other two in a few slides up. Okay. So, you know, kind of before we talk about what we can do, you know, what can we do to make our sites more accessible? We need to think about what must we do. All right. So everyone knows about the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act. And most of us, when we think about it, we think, oh, that's ramps into buildings. Oh, that's at sidewalks, making sure that we can get in and out of the sidewalks. It's making sure we have handrails in the bathroom. And we're thinking of very physical attributes of physical buildings. And so I want to ground you in how many of you have ever benefited from those ADA accommodations? Have you ever ridden your bike up and down those ramps or pushed a stroller, right? Have you actually ever felt really secure having that balance of even having someplace to hang your bag? Maybe we weren't using these accommodations in the way that they were intended, but we're all benefiting from them. So when the ADA came out, web compliance wasn't really on their mind. There is no strict ADA guideline for what is required. However, federal agencies and their contractors must conform with what's called the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG. And right now we're at WCAG 2.0, but 2.1 is coming out. WCAG 2.1, the nice thing is as you make your sites compliant, it's not as if the old requirements go away. We just add new ones. So in the latest version, they've added about 17 new criteria because they realized, sorry about that, that we need to really be addressing mobile accessibility. They want to talk more about low vision. But I think what's really on the forefront is this idea of we need to be thinking about cognitive impairments and learning disabilities as well. So while federal agencies need to stick to WCAG, it's been kind of the Wild West for the web, but people are really becoming aware. In 2018, there were over 2,000 federal accessibility lawsuits that had tripled from 2017. And I think perhaps the most famous is Domino's Pizza versus Guillermo, I'm going to mess up his name and I apologize, Robels. Guillermo is a screen reader user. He uses JAWS, which is the #1 screen reading software at the time. And he went to order a pizza and discovered that Domino's new software is not screen reader compliant. He cannot order any type of specialty pizza, etc. The response was, no problem, call up your order. You know, what are you going to do? Call up and have them read off the whole menu to you? So he sued and made it way up through the courts. Domino's brought a rebuttal of this doesn't count all the way up to the Supreme Court. And last January, the Supreme Court denied their appeal. And so we're really starting to see really severe reactions to what it means we're going to have to do. So right now, even though it's not required, the idea is that everyone should be following what's called the WCAG guidelines. So, you know, where do these WCAG guidelines come from? You know, what are they based in? The acronym I would love for you to leave here with, because I'm a teacher and I always want to feel like I taught somebody something, is POUR. So web accessibility can be broken down into 4 aspects. That's perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. So let's talk perceivable. All right. Most of this is pretty straightforward. If you have some sort of sound, make sure you provide text for those who cannot hear. Do you have audio, video? You know, provide audio for those who cannot see. Those two tend to be kind of straightforward, people think, but even I have trouble with that. I sometimes will watch videos and they've added closed captions. I'm great with that. That's wonderful. Sometimes people when they have video, they have the closed captions where they highlight the word as you read it. And I find that kind of distracting, right? So there's no right answer yet for everything there. I personally now upload all my videos to YouTube because they will automatically caption them for me, right? The next one is more technical and is a little more applicable to those of you who are creating their websites. And it's this idea that we want to use semantic markup. For those of you who used to grade papers or mark up papers, you remember what I'm talking about. You'd put your little symbol, oh, this is a paragraph. You didn't make it look like a paragraph. You didn't give it the syntax of a paragraph. We want to do the same thing for our web pages. The number one thing, and I find the humor in that I used color to emphasize this, is we really want to make sure that we're using good color contrast. And here's the key. We're human. We don't know if it's good color contrast. Good color contrast is something we're going to use a computer to distinguish. All right, so if you have your website in front of you, as I think a few of you have, I'm going to go out on a limb and assume that people sometimes have multiple browsers open right now, some listening to me while you're doing some other things. If you have your browser open right now, oh, hey, is there anything on here that someone who is blind, deaf, low vision, or colorblind, would they not be able to perceive it? Just eyeball that right now, and I'll show you how to test it a little bit later. Questions on perceivable, Kristen? Does anyone have a full circle back around?
I'll just ask this question. They want to know, I mean, we will archive this. They would like to know if you'll make the slides available as well.
Sure, absolutely.
And just something to keep in your head for as you go through things. Someone said, I'd love information on alternatives to using the words click here on websites or in emails. How do you know which words to hyperlink?
Excellent. I've got a slide on that, so I'm very excited. Good.
Thank you.
All right, so we had perceivable, operable. I want to tie operable back to that one of those number one disability groups, which is the ability to have sometimes you have physical limitations, right? So the number one thing you can do with your website is make sure that someone can navigate it without a mouse. Someone who is just using peeves is when I go to a site and I've read it all, or let's at least pretend I've read it all, and you have to scroll all the way to the bottom and to prove that you read it, right? Well, if you're using a screen reader, it doesn't scroll, right? So they can never click, I'm done, because the computer's like, no, I'm forcing you to somehow use a mouse to go down. So number one thing is that we want to ensure that navigation through your page we can do with the keyboard. Second, I think we've all been at sites where you have the pop-up ads and the videos and the animations and the media. One that can be really hard for people to turn that on and off. Plus, let's all admit it's super embarrassing when you're in a meeting and all of a sudden your computer's the one that starts playing that viral video. I think I've sent Kristen a few during department meetings, but I really shouldn't have. Panda bears, who knew? Okay. You want to avoid time limits for filling things out. It takes some people longer. And then I really like number 4. You should expect mistakes, right? If someone is at your site and you're asking them to fill something out or scroll up or down, we really want to offer clear instructions and warnings. And if somebody does something the wrong way, we want to offer multiple attempts. So if you're going back through these slides later, this would be your next quality check. Is your site easy to use and control? And I'm going to show you another slide here that might alter your perception of what it means to use and control. Here's some different input devices people use. All right, so in the first one, we actually have someone using a stick to do a voting machine. All right, the middle, we have a joystick right here in the middle. My son's friend uses a joystick for measurable things. Off here to the right, I have a refreshable Braille keyboard. So it can actually come out in Braille, it can pop it up and they can read the Braille as they go along. The keyboard along the bottom here, This is a stick keyboard. So the keys are closer together, so you don't have to move the stick as far to enter your input. And then I also have a puff mouse here on the far side. But if you really want to make sure your site is accessible to the greatest range of people, one of the greatest things, and I hate advertisements to happen for accessibility, is the mobile phone. All right, it's just accessibility is just built in. I mean, think about asking for directions, right? You can have both text and sound. It's just, they've done some amazing things. All right, so when we talk about operable, that O for operable, you know, it's not always what we think. Okay, so understandable. We're all going to have different ideas for this one. And again, we also have to look at our target audience, right? We want to make sure that our language is clear and concise. If you have text, a lot of text, could you include an illustration or maybe a video, some other format? And that's a tricky one because you want to make sure that people can access the information from many equal ways, right? I know somebody in our department who has decided, no, he's not going to use any more pictures. He's only going to use text because he wants to be as accessible as possible. We're debating on that. I don't think you need to completely eliminate one. Instead, you should be supplementing. Third step is consistent navigation. Make sure when people are at your page, they can say, oh, I clicked somewhere. How do I get back to where I was before? Or later, if they need to recreate these steps. Was it a maze? Was it just they kept clicking and eventually got to where they wanted to go? And once again, for understandable, you want to provide guidance for when people go wrong. I think a classic example is when you're filling out a form on a website and you hit submit, and then you wait, and you don't know, did it submit? Did it not submit? I'm not sure. Well, it would be really helpful if we could include some instructions. I did want to mention, this is an additional place to kind of reflect upon color. I mentioned for perceivable that you want to make sure you use good color contrast, and we're kind of thinking about color blindness. Well, understandable, I found that people often use colors in ways that are not clear across communities. So in one community, the color red may mean like dangerous. Don't click on this. Don't hit submit until you're done. Well, in other communities, red can mean good luck, right? So this idea of avoiding color to describe things. All right, my last tenet of POUR is that robust, all right? And what I have here is, I realize I have an acronym I didn't define, and that's W3. And W3 stands for the World Wide Web Consortium. Nobody owns the internet. No matter what anyone tells you, no matter what any politician tells you, no one owns the internet. But the W3 is a consortium of researchers, developers who are like, where's the web going and how can we best keep it from becoming the Wild West? So following W3 guidelines and WCAG standards are kind of the best way to go. And if you don't know them, then making sure that the people you hire know them. This is where I love teaching my students. You don't have to know how to do it yourself. You just need to know which acronyms to drop to make them nervous. Okay? When your site is done, have you tested it across platforms or browsers, different devices? Have you ever been to a site and when you look at it on the phone, you can't get any information, but it's great on the laptop? The other thing that I like to talk about is that computer browsers like Chrome, Safari, Firefox, I call them the helicopter parents of programming, all right? Because what happens is you can have horrible code. You can have all your markup wrong, and the browser says, it's okay. I know what you meant, and it displays a pretty picture to the people who are visiting. But for people who are using assistive devices and technology, it's complete chaos, right? So these different syntax errors that don't affect like our visual presentation can completely cripple other people's experience. All right, so kind of that quality check you'd want to ask your developer, and maybe that developer is you, is, you know, did we use best practices, right? Questions before I go on the POUR, the basic, and to be honest, there's a little overlap. I feel like operable and understandable can go over each other a little bit. All right. So this is where I'm going to now start talking to you about we want poor. Poor is our goal. So what are some of the common issues that mess up sites? You know, that kind of say, oh, I wish I knew a little bit more about this. And a lot of these common issues, I'm going to link back when I talk about beyond web accessibility, when I talk about your Google Docs, your PowerPoint slides, your Twitter accounts, your Facebook accounts, these other places that we're on the web for disseminating information. All right. So the first one is landmarks. All right. So in the beginning, if you were to go back and look at Yahoo and like the early web pages, well, one, they're really ugly. And one of the reasons they look really ugly is because everything was created as a table. And by the way, that meant screen readers would actually read out table element to everything that was out there. So it was the Wild West of tables. And so then when people moved away from that, they used something called divs. So it was like dozens and dozens of divs, and divs stood for divisions. Here's one part of my page, here's another part of my page. Imagine your entire thesis made completely of paragraphs, right? That's what we were dealing with. So what we really needed, and what they tried to do with HTML5, which is the latest version, is say, how can we make this more like a table of contents? How can we mark up our page to say, here's my header, and here's my nav, here's the main section of the page, and a footer, and article, and things like that. So these words I have right here, these markup tags, these really make up the basis of a quality web page. And you should have most of these tags in each page. And if your developer doesn't have them, I would ask them, why? Well, they're not a specific part of my page that's kind of the main section. So landmarks are number one. The next one I called headings. And headings, I'm actually kind of wish I had taken a poll now. Kristen, I'm going to ask and just tell me if anyone says, I do. I'm curious if people have ever heard of H1, H2, H3, all the way up to H6 headings. Anyone, do I have any small show of hands? All right, because H1 is basically a heading 1, H2 is heading 3. And for years, when I asked my students, what does it mean for something to be an H1 heading? Did anyone by any chance say they've heard of them a little bit? People said, yes, H1 is the big heading, H2 is smaller, each heading is just a little bit smaller. And all they were thinking about was what it looked like, right? And it's true, by default, they're smaller, but that's not really what they mean. Heading 1 should be the main content of your page. Heading 2 should be subheadings. You should really only have one H1 per page. It is not uncommon for me to go and do an accessibility check on a site, a UMSI site, for instance, a few years ago. It had 84 H3 headings and no H2s. They weren't using the tags for their real sense. They were like, oh, I like the size of that. I like the style of that. So headings are a really important way, because if we go back to that idea of keyboard navigation, people can use their keyboard to jump from heading to heading to heading. They couldn't do that when it was paragraph to paragraph to paragraph. Do we have a question? Are we good?
We do have one thing that has come in before. There was a question about touch screens and how mobile devices in general are really good for accessibility. One person did point out that older folks have issues with touch screens sometimes because of circulation issues.
Yes. Oh, yes. So to be honest, when I talk about touch screens, I don't know how many of you are familiar with, that kind of the timeline of Kindle readers, right? And this is an idea where technology got too good for its own britches. The previous Kindle had the buttons on the side where you would hit the button to turn the page, correct? Then we got to the new swipe Kindle. And so now I have family members who can't use their Kindle anymore because of the touch screens, because if you touch and you can't get a clean swipe, it jumps multiple pages. So absolutely, this is where we were talking about this idea of using using different tags and testing. That's where that robustness comes in. You need to test on multiple platforms. And sometimes you do need an app instead of a web page because there's extra technology there that they can use. I think that was a good question. All right, so this is a big one. We're going to spend a little time on images here today because they're important, right? The web is visual. The first web pages, I don't know if you know this, they were developed by physicists because there's nothing more exciting to a physicist than reading physics papers. And the only thing more exciting is reading a physics paper that you could click another physics paper and just read another physics paper. But it wasn't until Mosaic, the Mosaic browser, where you could start adding images, then I mean, the internet just exploded. Okay, so images can be both decorative and informative. And as we all know, an image can be worth 1,000 words. So what does that mean if someone can't actually see the image? All right, we want to make sure that all images, regardless of whether they are decorative or 1,000-word worthy, that they have something called alternative text. We kind of shortcut that to, I call it alt text. Alt text is the general terminology. And what alt text does is it allows people to kind of express the content and function of an image to be accessible. And by the way, this somewhat ties back to that whole read more, click me, this idea of we really want to be expressive when we're using words here, all right? So let's go here. So alt text, what most people know is that it is read by screen readers in place of the images, right? It is also, however, displayed in place of the image if the image file can't be loaded. So if you have patrons who maybe have really slow internet access, by having good alt text, you're really helping them out because if their computer is too slow to load the image, you're giving them that same information that they would otherwise miss, all right? And for those of you in business, my tip of my hat to you again, it does improve your search engine optimization, right? Google can search your alt text and help build up your brand, all right? So how do we create alt text? I'm going to give you a few tips and then we're going to play with this a little bit. First, the image should present the function of the image. Like the text should do the function of it. Why is the image there? I don't need a description of the physical people in it unless that's part of the function. Be short. Again, our colleague who's going all out with accessibility, he got in a little trouble because his alt text was like paragraphs and paragraphs long. And he got some complaints. He's like, no, we always try to do the right thing and we're all gonna mess up, right? My feeling is if you're not messing up, you're not really trying. Just hopefully we mess up on a smaller scale, okay? You don't wanna repeat text that's already somewhere else in the page, right? You don't wanna be repetitive. And please don't use the image of or graphic of, etc. All right, Kristen, this is where we're going to use the, I think you have some polls set up for us, I believe. So
I've just launched the first poll.
Okay, and can I move it off to the side?
Yeah.
All right, so I'm going to pop up here. So here we have George Washington, right here. And we have a picture of George, and underneath George is the text. Because of his role as commander-in-chief, he later became the first president of the United States. George Washington is often called the father of his country. So my question for you is, oh, I can't vote, okay. Which one is an appropriate alt text for this image? Should the alt be alt equals image of George Washington, the first president of the United States? An empty alt simply means you're putting the information in there, alt equals empty quotes, and it's expressing to the screen reader, I see you, I just don't have anything to say. Like this isn't important, okay? And then the final one would be George Washington. Do we have any votes?
And the poll.
In the poll?
And share the results.
Interesting. Okay, so what we have here is we have quite a few people say image of George Washington. And what we really was one of the first clues that we want is we don't want to use words like image of. If the screen reader is reading it out already, it knows it's an image. So we don't really want the image of George Washington. George Washington, the first president. Why would we want to stay away from that one? Just because that text is redundant, because it was in the text that was underneath the picture, which is interesting because if you did the alt text before you wrote the text, I could see why you would do B, right? An empty alt attribute, I could see that, except for it would kind of, everything is negotiable, by the way. It depends on, is that picture part of the same paragraph? Is it part of the same division? Screen reader might not know, especially since you're seeing the picture before the text, right? So in this case, the most viable choice would be D. It would be to simply have alt text that reads off George Washington. Okay, should I close that? Okay, so let's go to number 2. I'm going to scroll down here for a second. In example 2, we have an image. Underneath the image, we have a caption, all right, with the words George Washington. And then we actually include the same exact text as above. So the only difference between example 1 and example 2 is that in this case, I have included a caption underneath the image or label. All right, we'll take a quick guess. Let's go ahead and see what people answered on this one.
Actually, I'm going to hold it just a minute longer.
Actually, I'm going to read it off. So option A is George Washington. Option B is that empty alt text. Option 3 is image. And option, and I don't know if you're seeing A, B, C, or D, or what you're seeing. The final option is you just don't need an alt attribute because everything we need to know is there.
Okay, we're just at the halfway point of voting. Let's give it 5 more seconds.
Well, it's okay to have dead air time.
It's never quiet around here. All right, it looks like we've gotten to a stopping point.
Okay.
So let's show the results.
It is the hardest part of teaching, is waiting that 5 seconds to see if students are going to answer or not.
That's
All
right.
So we've got, for those who picked George Washington, we wouldn't want that simply because it's redundant for the text directly underneath it. It's actually part of the image. It's the image caption. I'm going to jump down to image. Again, we don't really want that because it doesn't describe the purpose, right? What is the purpose of having that picture there? The final answer, the image does not need an alt attribute, versus what I'm going to say is the correct answer in this case is the empty alt attribute. It's so hard to figure out the difference between it. And what I kind of say is, imagine you're talking to a group of people and you say, does anyone have any questions? And if people say no, you're like, great. Even if you don't believe them, at least they said no, right? But if you say, if you have any questions and people just stare back at you, you don't know. So that empty alt, that alt equals empty quotes, again, it's recognizing people are using screen readers saying, hey, I've got an image here, but adding additional text isn't going to add anything to your experience. Okay? All right, let's go to number 3. And with number 3, this is tricky. To be honest, when I did this one, it took me a second. All right, I'm going to move it off to the side, and I'm going to describe why it was tricky so it doesn't trick you up. Right here, we have a picture of George Washington with the caption underneath, George Washington. What you may not be able to see, what I did not notice, is that there is a blue line surrounding George Washington. And if I were to put my mouse over him, this is actually a link to a Wikipedia page, right? That's that use of color to convey meaning that we talked about, how that's not good. So in this case, is would we do the empty alt attribute? Would we have Wikipedia entry for George Washington, the infamous read more, or simply George Washington? I'm going to let people go ahead and vote in quiet for a second.
I actually have a question.
Great.
While you guys are voting, the question came up, almost all library websites have a library logo or a business logo on it. So would an alt tag like XYZ library logo suffice?
So,
or is using the word logo similar to using the word image and we should have avoided it?
Right, so that's a great question. Part of it depends, like, so if your logo is actually the words of your, like, if there's already text in the page that says the name of your library, then you don't need to repeat the full logo. Instead of alt equals logo, some people do prefer, so it's okay, to say a common one, if you're really uncomfortable with alt equals empty quotes, decorative is a common one. So alt equals decorative, because I'm not sure, but I believe people in their screen readers, they can like even set it up to skip that word, right? So yes, so if you have a logo, logo is fine, decorative is fine, but what you don't want to do is repeat the words unless the words don't exist, which we'll get to on that. I don't know if you remember that first slide you did, Kristen. We'll take a look at that.
By the way, do I put alt equals quotation marks, decorative and quotation marks?
Yes, so yes. Again, I've really tried to encourage people though to really just say the alt equals quote, and no space, nothing, just quote, quote, double quotes. Yeah. Double quotes, I guess.
And the decorative tool, you see that a lot in WordPress sites.
Yes, yes.
You have that option of marking that an image is decorative.
Okay,
And
what did we get? Okay.
And one more question,
Yeah.
is the empty alt equals quote, quote, like an artifact? An artifact is in quotation marks.
Not sure exactly what you mean by that question. Let me read the question. Maybe it'll, I don't know if I can see it. Oh, I don't see it. Answered. Oops. Oh, let me think about that one. I don't know what I did here.
She's saying, I guess artifact is another term for decorative.
Yes, so no, it's definitely not, it doesn't actually mean decorative, because sometimes you have things that aren't decorative at all. They're, I mean, I guess they're still decorative, but I guess in my mind, when I look at them, they're not actually very pretty. They can also be functional, but their functionality is just to be a placeholder. You know, like, hey, I'm gonna leave this empty, maybe I'll be adding something later to it. Yes, no, thank you. Did I close up the poll somehow? Did I somehow click on something so we didn't see the, so I'll just tell you, for example 3, okay. The important thing was that it should have been the Wikipedia entry for George Washington, right? Because that is the function of that image. The function of that image is for you to click on it. Okay. Hey,
Good job, everybody.
Hey. And I'm going to scroll down here for a second. You can see what would have been a better choice, by the way, is for the developer to have put that picture and the text together to make it more clear to people that it's a clickable element. All right, so let's look at number 4. I'm talking slowly. I realize I only have 10 minutes left.
Yep,
12, okay. All right, so we're gonna do this last one, and actually I'm just gonna talk you through this last one, because here's a perfect example of, I don't know what the right answer is. So it's this beautiful, famous picture of, you know, George Washington crossing the Delaware. Pretty sure you don't want it to be A, because that's not really why the picture's there. B, again, it's a painting of, it's kind of like a picture of. The difference might be, what if you had a painting, a photograph, versus sketch art, right? Again, the question is, why is this picture here? Is it a, you know, either one of C or D could work. It kind of depends on, why are you including this picture? What course are you covering? What topics are you covering along that line? Okay, so all right, so I'm gonna go back. And now is when I do my nervous, I didn't think I'd have enough to talk about. I guess I forget, I talk a lot. So I do have a tool here, by the way. I love, it's this little decision tree where it walks you through, what is the purpose of your text? Is it functional or is it decorative? Are there words in it? So this alt text tool is really handy, so I tried to include it in there. In line with images, I want to talk to people about icons. All right, people love their icons, their Twitter links, their Pinterest links, all these links. Here's the problem with icons. Icons are not images. They do not take alt text. Even worse, people use them all the time to link to somebody else. So if you have a link that is also an icon, a screen reader doesn't know why it doesn't know it's there. It is not reading off phone, bus stop, etc. So instead you need to use something called ARIA labeled by. And it's a deeper question. But something just you should know. I also just wanted to mention that what I don't like about icons is they're not intuitive, because for instance, children don't know that that's a phone. Oddly enough, my children are always like, what's that a picture of? To them, that's not what a phone is. Okay? Infographics. We love our infographics. I started this talk with infographics. How in the world do you take an infographic and make alt text for it? To be honest, you can't. What you need to do instead is, I'll show you where I got these. Hey, that looks familiar. Colleen stole that and that and that. If I scroll to the bottom of this screen, you can see that they have included text that describes everything. If you can't do it in a few sentences, provide an alternate kind of way to get that information out. All right, so I'm going to do a couple tests real quick. This is where you can come along if you'd like. This site is called wave.webaim.org. And if we go there, I'm going to start off by, we're going to start with our friends at mel.org. Oh, shoot. Sorry. I gave you the right one, but I don't think I actually linked it. wave.webaim.org. All right. I'm going to start with mel.org. And when we go here, we can see their site. Look at you. You have 0 errors. You have a couple alerts. I can look at your page. I'm going to make it a little smaller, sorry, so we can all see a little better. And we can see things like, hey, they have 22 images and they included alternative text on all of them. They have a form label. You used 1 H1, 2 H2s. You did an excellent job on this one. I do see one issue. I'm going to click on contrast, and they are unhappy. This is a great example. They're unhappy right here. Let me refresh this, sorry. They're very unhappy because they think you can't read the words, find the right resources better and faster. I want you to think, we can see it. It's white on black, right? It looks like great color contrast. Well, the issue is that they don't always know when you have a background image, right? In addition, you don't always know if your background image is going to load. So you want to set default background colors. I'm going to go to one more site we saw here. I believe it was indiepl.org.
And Sonia says, Sonia
Yeah.
from Mel says,
Yeah.
they told us about that and we thought it was good enough.
Yeah, and it's good. You're aware, right? So you can do those. So I went to Indy, and the reason I typed it right in here is I did want to show you, you can install Wave as an extension. So I'm going to do that real quick. All right, so Indy, we have a few more issues. I'm going to click on them. And pretty common issues. The majority is empty links and missing form labels. So I'm going to turn off Wave just so we can look at this. But all right, here. All right, yes, exactly. Thank you, Indy. I appreciate you doing this just so I can show you. If you notice, they've used these icons down here, right, that we just talked about, the ones everyone loves. Well, screen reader says, I don't know what this is. If I were to open this up as a programmer, what it says to me is, hey, there's a link, but I don't know what's in. I'm going to close this. It's even confusing to me. There's no words here. It's just a little icon. That's where you need that area labeled by to say this is going to Facebook and Twitter. But someone who is blind or vision impaired would not know where you're going to. All right. And then you had some contrast colors, which again, I'm guessing is mostly background images, but just in case, I'm going to do a quick look. If you do have yes, because you can see that it doesn't see any colors at all. Because normally, in this case, it thinks it's white on white. You can play with these tools, and as you make the background darker, it'll tell you when you pass WCAG, AA, and AAA. AA is kind of the standard most people go for. All right, I'm going to go back just because Mel, you're challenging me here. So I'm going to go back to this site one more time and show one more tester that's really kind of, in my mind, in my class, the gold standard. I'm going to go here to inspect. Axe is one of the extensions you can add, but it's not very intuitive to how you actually make it work. So I'm going to click Analyze, and you can see here we've got actually did really well. I have to say, you've just done an incredible job on this site. Here they actually mentioned, hey, you have alternative text that's actually repeated in the text later on. All right, so Wave and Axe are two of my kind of go-to testing systems that I use. All right, quick note on your keyboard navigation. All right, you really want to make sure that we avoid these like bottomless pits. Like when you get into Twitter and you just can't get out of someone's Twitter feed because there's no way using the keyboard. One of the things I really like to see on people's sites is something called skip to content. Well, just because you did such a great job, I bet you have it. I'm going to go to their site, and the first thing I'm going to do this just in case, is I'm going to hit the tab button. And I'd like you to look up, my guess is in this upper corner. When I hit the tab button, did you all see that? This little skip to main content that popped up? If I click on that or hit enter, it takes me to the good stuff, right? I didn't need to go and do tab, actually, tab. They did a great job on just making it easier to kind of get through. Tab focus is this idea of putting a border around things. All right, so we're not going to do this here, but if you are interested, I tried to put in just things you can do to test out your page. And it's really interesting. Just unplug that mouse or disable your mouse, your touchpad. What happens? All right. If you're really interested, I included 2 full testing checklists. Now, why do we not just use Wave or just use Axe? We need humans. We need someone to hit that keyboard. We need someone to listen to your screen on a screen reader and realize when the wording is too complex or you've skipped over things, right? So remember that accessibility really starts with these proper H1 main tags, that when you get too into your styling, you can actually make it harder. I can't remember, can you remind me the name of the person from Mel?
Sonia.
Sonia said that people had told her about that. It'd be really interesting to learn, did they talk to you at the beginning when you were first developing your page, or was it something you discovered later? If you get into the habit of using these tools early, it can really make a big difference.
You said it was a year in.
A year in, and sometimes that's a little painful, right? So definitely this Vox checklist. This checklist is not just for programmers. It's also for managers, quality assurance, everybody. So I really recommend the Vox checklist. Okay, so beyond websites, this is my favorite part. I only have 2 minutes, so I'm going to go quickly. The first thing I need to do is tell you that my slide is already outdated after making it yesterday. All right. If you're going to do Word, I want to let you know that Word has an accessibility checker. Just like it has spell check, you can go right up to the top and say Tools, Accessibility Checker. It'll tell you all kinds of great things like too many spaces. I know that I have been very guilty of not using headings in my Word documents. Instead, I just change things to be 14 point or 16 point. Why am I not just using heading? I don't know. The reason I had to skip Google Docs is because it changes. Google Docs is always innovating. The checker's gone. It used to be there, and now it's gone. And this is why Word is currently kind of the recommended software to use, because it's very stable. This is when I show you my Twitter account. All right. If I show you nothing else, I wanted to show you that if you're tweeting for your, oh, I actually sent the instructions. If you're tweeting for your company, I would recommend that you go into More, Settings and Privacy, Accessibility, and there's this little button you click that says Compose Image Descriptions. This will now allow you to add alt text to all the images you tweet. In the same way, I know I'm coming to the end. Yes, these are all pictures of my children. You can click on Edit any of the images. You can't add alt text by default. You can't add it when you upload it. but later if you click on edit or remove, you can change alt text. Facebook loves the idea of generating alt text for you. It's not very good. It's why we get all these click here, learn more. And that's also why we need humans. If we're gonna automate everything, they just don't understand the context. All right, so as I leave you today, and I'm happy to stay for a minute if people have questions, is I'd like you to leave thinking, how can you improve the accessibility of your page? I hope you found even one thing. And then second, how can you promote accessibility at your workplace, among your colleagues, among your friends? I'm constantly showing people that Twitter tool, right? So I have some of my favorite resources in the slides, which again, happy to share with you. I also follow 2 Twitter accounts. WebAx has incredible tips, and EJ Mason has tips and just incredible perspectives as somebody who's working and living within the accessibility space. And then the kind of those key takeaways. I really hope accessibility just become part of your design. I hope you realize that small steps can make big differences. And most importantly, tools can help, but the human element is still needed. And my last plug is, if you can employ people who are super users of the technology, right? Let's do that. Let's employ them to really make it take some of their strengths and help improve all of our sites. If you have any questions, again, sorry I talked for 61 minutes about that.
We do have one more question, actually 2. One, you talked about adding alt text for Twitter. What about alt text for Instagram? And as you're thinking about the answer, if you have to leave us because we're on the hour, we do have a link to a Google form for feedback, and that helps us get data to send back to our funders at IMLS. Okay, so alt text for Instagram.
So I have to admit, I'm sure you can do it. I don't Insta myself. I'm trying to cut back on my social media use, but I believe Instagram has actually been they were the ones who were trying to do the automated, but you can add alt text. If I can find it, I'll tack it on to the end of my slide. So, all right. But I don't know the actual steps myself.
I want to point out that Colleen has a couple of books for children, including one she wrote with her son on HTML. And from the very first words of those books, she's building accessibility into how you learn about web pages. I have another question for you. Do you offer an online class if I want to dig in deeper? Can you talk a little bit about your MOOC courses?
Sure. So I started off doing a MOOC for web design, and it's out there, and I think it's great that we're trying to reach more people. I've actually been encouraging people, however, to do the free version and not the paid version. So if people would like to go, they can either go to through Coursera. I've also been trying to develop WD4E.com. I think it's .com. I haven't gone to be honest, I have a student working on it. I've tried to take all of my Coursera stuff and take it from behind the paywall and just put it up for free. However, my favorite site, if you do want to learn on your own, is somebody called Shay Howe, which I will bring up for you just because I know I'll forget it. And I think this person does an amazing job of web design. And the reason I really like it is he as well talks about accessibility, but you can't learn web design by reading. And he has incorporated a lot. Sorry, I'm scrolling so quickly. I'm looking for something called CodePen. And in CodePen, you get to type as you write. Apparently, there was no CodePen in this one. Here we go. Edit on CodePen. So I really like Shay Howe, SHAYHOWE, because you can actually learn how to do things in real time, which I don't have in my Coursera course. So I can change things to say 3. And it automatically updates. It's free. I think he just does an amazing job. So.
That's super helpful. This will be our last call for questions. I do want to point out that we do have students who specialize in testing websites for issues of accessibility, to the success of interactive elements. And so I've put that link at the bottom. We recruit year-round, but we don't always have classes year-round. There's always a particular interest in libraries because of we would love to support communities more broadly. You can see online, we do have one more webinar in this series, and then we'll launch a new batch for April through August, and that's Design Thinking with Megha Subramanian, coming up on March 10th, which is another Tuesday at 4 o'clock Eastern. Those of you who know Megha know that she pioneered the youth experience specialty at the University of Maryland, and her brain is just a delightful collection of experiences and ideas. So you don't want to miss that. However, I was reminded to come back to when we have emails and things or websites, should we be doing click here and then highlight it?
Right. So you want to do not do click here. You really don't want to do click here for multiple reasons. Some super users actually can turn on something so that all the links for the page show up as a list on the left-hand side. And when your list is all just click here, learn more. The reason we see click here and learn more is because people tend to use WordPress sites, and that's their default text. It should always be a description of what will happen when they click here. So not click here, it should be click here for more on X, learn more about Y. You really don't want the click here. It's also debatable as to whether you should have, like go to in the entire URL, which sounds bad when a screen reads it, but on the opposite hand, if you have someone else is helping them type it in, they might actually need to know what the URL is. So there's trade-offs, but I would really avoid the click here and learn more and read me. You really don't want to use them. That's the last kind of challenge. We are going to post these slides. I challenge you to run them through the PowerPoint accessibility checker. I just left. I put some things in, but for instance, I have, what does it mean when there's missing, this is where we talked about, do you need alt text if there's just various shapes back here, right? Versus here, there's missing title, et cetera, et cetera. So it can be really interesting to kind of figure out where should there be things. So I challenge you to start hitting accessibility tests on everything.
Well, thank you to those of you who hung on for the last few minutes. We will be processing this and adding it to our archive site, and you should get an email hopefully within 48 hours. And we hope that this will be valuable for you to share with other folks. And again, if you can click on that Google Docs link to view the evaluation form, that really helps us send a message back to our funders about what you need and what you benefited from. So we'll bring this to a close. We hope we'll see you again next month with Megha. Thanks and have a good day.